we introduced the Quances just a little bit ago, and I want to let you know that this isn't just a random family that we decided to bring in. It wasn't just that we were looking around and we thought, okay, Minnesota isn't that many states away, so it shouldn't be too difficult for them to move here. You know, the area that they live in is pretty similar to ours, so their transition shouldn't be that difficult. No, the process that we go through in order to hire somebody on as a staff member and to entrust with, in this case, our students, to send them on trips, but also to entrust with their spiritual walk is a big deal. And we go through a lot of different criteria. We look at a lot of different things. When I came here, there was a team that came together and they interviewed multiple people. They watched sermons from multiple people, conversations, you know, within the body, conversations outside of the body. It was a long, not drawn out as in like we're dragging our feet and we're taking our time, but it was a long, drawn out process before we came. And we follow the same procedure and the same kind of method whenever we're looking at anybody. You know, Courtney grew up here. And Carrie grew up here, but there was still a process to walk through and to kind of pray about and decide about, is the Spirit leading for this person to be the person to step into a role that is going to have that kind of responsibility in the lives of the people of this community? And any time that I'm gone and any time I'm not speaking up here, there is a process that I go through when it comes to, am I going to invite, are we going to invite this person to step onto this platform and to hold this microphone or whatever microphone they use, that obviously don't get too wrapped up in it being the microphone with the blue tape around it, but to step up and to teach and to preach. It's not something that's like, you know, I feel like that person hasn't ever gotten up and said anything ever before, so I'm just going to ask them to get. No, there is a process that we walk through, and it has nothing to do with their favorite sports team is, although some of you might get disqualified for some of the sport teams that you cheer for, because mostly it makes me question your faith. But there's a process that we walk through, and so as I'm getting ready to be gone a couple of times over the next couple of months, I've begun to look through just some different criteria and some different people. And I came across one. This individual is actually a published author. And so, I mean, that's a pretty big deal, written quite a few books. And we've been, you know, praying about, is this a person that would be good to speak here? He's actually a church planter, which is, you know, that's a big deal. He's planted quite a few churches. But then, as I did a little bit more digging, I found out that he's also somebody who has, in his history, denied Christ as being God. He's denied Jesus as being risen from the dead, and that's kind of a big deal. So we should probably rule him out. So I came across this other one. This one actually has on his resume that in one message, 3,000 people came to know Jesus Christ. I mean, I've never given a message where that many people decided to give their lives to Christ. I've actually never spoken in front of 3,000 people, so maybe it's an unfair comparison, but I've never had that happen. This person was a pillar of the church. Like an absolute rock in the church. And he's also an author. But as we looked through and kind of got some information about this person, we found out that he also denied Christ at one point and has a tendency to kind of shoot from the hip and not really think about what it is that he's saying, which some of you might think that, well, you do the same thing, Justin, so what's the big deal? Well, he would do it and had a little bit of a temper as he was doing it, so probably figured that's probably not the best one. This one was, this would actually make an excellent pastor, because this guy was excellent with finances. And there's a lot of financial things that you have to consider. Also very accomplished with his words, and an author and a historian, I guess you could call him. But as we looked into his history, we realized that while he is great with finances, he is also great at taking other people's finances when he's not supposed to take their finances. And that's kind of a big deal. These guys, they're actually a team, and they're incredibly passionate. I mean, they are gung-ho everywhere they go, but they're also, they have a nickname or a reputation of kind of being a little bit abrasive and getting angry really quickly and shoving things down people's throat. And it turns out that in today's church, people don't like to have things shoved down their throat. They like to hear it a little bit nicer than these guys are able to do that. So figured probably shouldn't use them. So we've kind of ruled out as being guest speakers in our congregation, really probably ever being pastors of this congregation, Paul, Peter, James, John, and Matthew, because of some things that we've heard from their friends and some things that they have in their history that is just like, nope, sorry, we gotta rule these guys out. And what we began to realize as we were looking at that and looking at these gentlemen and whether or not they would be adequate people to bring in here, whether as a pastor or as a speaker, there was a very big truth that came out, and that is that everyone has someone with a negative word to say about them. Everyone has someone with a negative word to say about them. Now, I know we've all gone to the funeral where we hear that everybody loved him or her. Nobody had a bad word to say about him or her. And I would say baloney. Everybody has somebody with a negative word to say about them because everybody has hurt somebody at some point. What we have a tendency to do is we read through stories like this, and man, we read about Paul's story, and we read about how he used to hunt down Christians and actually lead them to the place where they would be murdered. And as we read about Peter's story, and we read that, I mean, one, he lost his cool and he cut off a dude's ear, and then he denied Jesus 3 times after saying that he would never deny Christ. As we read about the sons of thunder, James and John, and the reputation that they had, and just the consistent argument they had of they wanted to be at Jesus' right and left, meaning they wanted to be the top of the disciples. As we read about Matthew and we read about how he was a tax collector who would cheat others, and then he's hanging out with the very people that he would have cheated because Jesus has called other people to follow him that Matthew would have turned his back on and cheated out of their taxes, cheated out of their money. As we read about them, what we have a tendency to do is we let them off the hook because we let biblical people off the hook simply because they're in the Bible. And we've read about, I think, this is what I do, and I think this is what a lot of us do. We let them off the hook because we know their whole story. We know how their story ends. We know that yeah, they used to be those people, but then they got to know Jesus and their life changed. And they turned things around and they began to follow him. And we can see their lives all the way up to the very end when they gave their lives for Christ. When they suffered persecution for Christ. Paul, who was beheaded because he refused to deny that Christ had risen from the dead. He kept teaching this thing that he was told not to teach, and Peter spent time in prison because he wouldn't stop preaching about Jesus. We can read their whole story, and so we let them off the hook because we know how the story ends. But if they were living today, and we read their story, it wouldn't matter that Peter preached to a crowd and 3,000 people came to know Jesus. What we would focus on is all of his failures. What we would focus on is the places where he messed up, the places that disqualified him from being a guy who could go out and who could preach the gospel, from being somebody who could actually be saved and then be given those opportunities. Human nature is to disqualify people because of the mistakes that they've made. And the thing about human nature, this is why I think that we let biblical people off the hook, simply because we know their whole story. Because in biblical times, this is exactly what they were doing to each other. They were disqualifying one another for their past and for their history and not for their current state. We see this with Paul, that when he's approached by Jesus and he's blinded and he gets his sight back and all of a sudden he's like, yep, this is the path that I'm supposed to go down. The other followers weren't like, sweet, Paul has come to know Jesus. They're like, Paul's going to come in here and he's going to trick us and he's going to kill us. This is all a plan to undermine the church. They didn't immediately go for it because human nature is to focus on the things that have been done in the past. Human nature is to focus on the weaknesses. And I say that too because they did the very same thing to Jesus himself. Now, we focus a lot on the end of Jesus' ministry, on the end of his life, when he went to the cross and he died and he rose again. And that's the part we should focus on, but we shouldn't ignore other pieces of his life. Like that moment when Jesus went back to his own hometown, a small town, probably a little bigger than Monroe City, which doesn't take much, but still a small town. All four Gospels make an account of this moment when Jesus goes back to his hometown. They share the story in slightly different ways. They share different pieces of the story and different things that were done and different things that were said, but they all capture the same thing, that even Jesus wasn't good enough or from the right family with the right background to be doing what it is that he was doing. To be this powerful prophet, which is what a lot of them thought of him as. To be this impactful teacher, this rabbi that was so influential. He was from the wrong family, from the wrong background, from the wrong small town, and he wasn't a big enough deal. And Jesus says this in Matthew 13:57, that a prophet is honored everywhere except in his own hometown and among his own family. Meaning, I can go all around this area that we live in, and they'll listen and they'll believe, and I'll be able to perform all of these miracles, but I come to my own hometown, and y'all won't listen. I just realized I have been living too close to Kentucky for too long because I just said y'all. Ugh. Oh. Okay, anyway. A prophet is without honor, or is honored everywhere except in his own hometown, because familiarity breeds contempt. Because when we get to know people, we remember, yeah, but this is the family that you're from. And let's face it, in small communities, there are a ton of advantages, but there are some big disadvantages. And one of those disadvantages is that everybody knows your business. And everybody knows about that thing that you did back when you were in high school that you weren't supposed to do, that you tried to hide from everybody else. And not only that, but everybody knows what your mama and your daddy did when they were in high school that they weren't supposed to do. And they might still be holding that against you also. And that's what Jesus experienced. As he comes into Nazareth, they say, isn't he just the carpenter's son? Meaning, isn't he just from that family that doesn't matter? Isn't he from that family where the woman had a baby out of wedlock? And this is the guy that we're supposed to listen to? In Mark chapter 6 and verse 5, it says, and because of their unbelief, he couldn't do any miracles among them except to place his hands on a few sick people and heal him. And John records it this way. In John 1:11, he came to his own people and even they rejected him. In John chapter 7:5 and Acts 1:14, we see that even his own brothers didn't believe in him until after the resurrection, which I can understand. I've got 4 brothers. And if one of them decided all of a sudden to start declaring that he's the Messiah and he's the second coming of Christ, I'd be like, baloney, I know what you did. I saw you grow up. I saw you lie to our parents. Now, I don't think Jesus lied to his parents, but maybe I'm putting too much of myself into Jesus or too much of humanity into Jesus, but he was a kid, and while he didn't sin, it doesn't mean he didn't pull pranks. And that doesn't mean he wasn't a little bit mischievous. He did it without sinning, but that doesn't mean that he was just always a joy to be around. Although maybe it does, because it is a joy to be around God. I don't know. We can go down that road sometime later. But even his own brothers didn't believe in him. And then in Luke chapter 4, in 29 through 30, Luke records it this way. It says, they got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him down the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. I mean, imagine that scene. You are coming back to your hometown. And because you are teaching things that are making people feel a little bit uncomfortable, and because you are stepping into what God has created you to be, what God has put before you as his plan for your life, not because you're being arrogant, but because God has created you to be a leader of people. God has created you to take his message out. And regardless of your history, regardless of what you've done in your past, God has created you to take his good news out. But because you come back and people are going, I know you, I know your family, they drag you to the edge of a cliff and they're getting ready to throw you over the edge of a cliff. I don't know where our nearest cliff is that would work for this, so we'll just say they're dragging you to the top of the water tower over here and they're going to throw you off the top of the water tower. That's what Jesus experienced in this moment. I haven't seen anything like this in my lifetime in the United States. I've seen things similar to it on the news in other countries, but not in our area. I haven't seen anybody in Monroe City literally try to take somebody out and stone them. Maybe we'll leave the stoning part out of it, but some of you get where I'm going with that. I haven't seen that happen, and I haven't seen people try and throw someone off of a cliff. But what I have seen is that because of history that we have with people, I've seen people literally walk out when somebody else gets up to speak because there's a history there. Because I know what you did when you were a kid, or I know what you did a year ago, and I'm not willing to admit that you might have changed. And one of the reasons I'm not willing to admit that you might have changed is because I haven't talked to you once since that happened. I haven't given you an opportunity to change or to show that you have changed. And so I've witnessed what I call the walkout. That when this person comes around, whether it's to get up here on this platform and speak or to lead worship or be on a worship team, or whether it's just that they're out and about and they're in the same room, I have to remove myself from the room because of something that's happened in the history of that person. Now, there is a time and there is a place to call out sin in one another. But what we tend to do is our human nature just disqualifies those who hurt us or those who have failed, either us or just in general, they have failed. We disqualify them from being a part of God's plan. We say there is no way that this person could ever bring a message that is worth me hearing because of what has been done in their past. Whether they did it to me or whether it's just something that they did. This person could never be used to take God's plan of taking his good news into the world. Now, like I said, we are very careful when we ask somebody to come up on this platform. That is not to say that we are careful to the point of I need to make sure that there is no spot in your life where there is any kind of sin or struggle or temptation going on in your life. Because we will never find that person, but two, I wouldn't be up here if that was the case. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, I actually remember this is one of the verses that we memorized in college way back in the day. It says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. Meaning your temptation is also common to others in the world. This is not a temptation that some of us are just going to be free from. We're all going to have temptation in our lives. Now, for some, it might be pornography or lust. For others, it might be lying or cheating or stealing or gossip. But there will be temptation in your life because you are human, and it is common to mankind to have temptation in our life. And that's why we don't say, hey, I need to make sure that everything in your life is figured out and perfect before you ever step up on that platform and take a microphone in your hand. It says, but God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. And when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure. And that's where the key comes into this. We know that every individual that we're going to come across, we don't necessarily like to let those off the hook who have hurt us, but deep down within us, we know that everyone is struggling with something. The question becomes, how are they struggling with it? If we come across an individual who is blatantly spitting in God's face and saying, I know that I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care what Scripture has to say. That's not an individual that we're going to invite to get up and to teach. It doesn't mean we're not going to invite them to be part of this congregation, but we're not going to invite them to get up and to teach. But if they're an individual who's like, hey, I've got struggles and I've got temptations, and sometimes my weakness, in my weakness, I give into those. And they're open and they're honest about it. They're struggling with Christ and they're asking Him to help them endure it and to get through it. Well, that person's a different story. See, if they're sitting there and they're saying, but Jesus died for my sins, so I can do whatever I want. We think of the words out of Romans chapter 6 when Paul writes, shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. See, there is temptation that all people have, and He provides a way out for it. And then there is unbridled sin, which is just, I'm going to do whatever I want, and I don't care. And those are two completely different types of people and two completely different approaches to sin. What we believe and what we try to live are those words where Jesus tells us that your ministry is supposed to be a ministry of reconciling people back to me. Do you know you don't have to reconcile somebody back to somebody if they've never done anything to offend or hurt that person? If they've never messed up, there's no need for reconciliation. Reconciliation comes when there is a mistake made, when there is sin made, when there is hurt made. And Jesus says, your job is to reconcile people back to me. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. Latch onto that piece. Not counting people's sins against them. And He has committed to us the ministry of reconciliation. Church, I have to ask, I ask myself this, I ask this of us as a congregation, are we holding against others what Christ has already redeemed? Some of you all really messed up in high school. Some of you all really messed up a lot more recently than high school. I can put myself right into that same some of you all. But Christ came so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be redeemed, and so that we could be reconciled back to Him. And as the body of Christ, as the bride of Christ, the church is one body. It's not, you can be reconciled to Him and I can be reconciled to Him, but there is no way that we are ever going to reconcile back to each other. My uncle, years ago, had kidney failure in both kidneys. And he had to go through the whole process of figuring out, okay, who can donate me a kidney? Who's willing to donate me a kidney? They did all the tests. Who's good for this? His sister was finally able to give him a kidney. But his body had to accept that kidney. His body had to reconcile with that kidney. His body had to make that kidney a part of itself. It wouldn't work if the rest of his body said, hey, we're all one body, but that kidney, it's an outsider. That kidney doesn't belong here. If the body rejects one piece, the body rejects its whole self. That's what we're taught throughout Scripture. He has given us this ministry of forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation. That's what Easter was all about. But our human nature gets in the way, and when someone steps up that we have a history with, we say, everyone except you. I've heard different reasons. I've been in ministry for 15 years. I've heard all sorts of different reasons. But you all invited me to come here 4 years ago. Let me read you a piece of my, I know I should have this memorized because it's my own resume. But I want to make sure I don't leave pieces of it out. It's in here somewhere. When I came here, I'd been in ministry for 12 years, and I was coming from a fairly large church of average attendance on the weekend of about 2,000 people, youth ministry of about 200 to 250 on a good week, which means Easter week. So I came from a large church. I'd had a lot of experience. I was serving on national teams, state teams, local teams, in different types of leadership. I was helping plan an international youth convention. I'd gotten a 3.5 plus GPA throughout my 4+ years at Mid-America Christian University. I had my master's in ministry when I got here. I was an experienced speaker, although not speaking every weekend in front of adults, which is a different kind of speaking than speaking to teenagers. I understand that. I was experienced when I got here in that realm. I had experience in leading worship, but most of my experience had been in the student ministry world. In the Church of God world that we are a part of, I had the right connections. I knew the right people. I'd gone to China with Andy Stevenson, who at one point was a guy who was the leader over all of Church of God youth ministries. I had sat down with Jim Lyon, who is the director of the Church of God, and had incredible conversations with him. That's all the stuff that they told me to put on my resume. But I was and still am someone who occasionally slips into gossip. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes it's because I know something and we're in a conversation. It's like, oh, hey, this would be helpful to the conversation. And I share it and I go, shoot, that's not something I should have shared. And sometimes it's because I have a piece of information that isn't mine to share, but man, it's so juicy. I really want to share it. And sometimes as soon as I do, I go, I shouldn't have shared that. And other times I go, I shouldn't have shared it, but it sure was fun to share it. In my history, I've been a liar. Sometimes out of convenience. As a kid, you get caught doing something, and you got to get your way out of it somehow, so you just make up a little lie. And then that lie becomes another lie, and that lie becomes another lie. But then as an adult, knowing better, it's still something that is occasionally a struggle and a temptation for me. And I can't stand up here in front of you and say, I haven't told a lie since I've become your pastor. Because I have. And that alone should disqualify me from being your pastor. I've been a thief in my life. I stole a pack of gum when I was a kid. But I've never stolen a car or, anything big like that. But through envy, I've stolen different things from people. Sometimes I've just stolen their moment and what should have been a time that was all about them. And instead I made it all about me because I needed people to look at me in that moment. I've been a backstabber in my life. I don't know that I'll ever forget the way that I treated Chauncey when I was growing up and how kind I was to him at youth group on Sunday and Wednesday and how good of friends we were at youth group. And without even realizing I was doing it, how poorly I treated him when we got to school. Until the day he finally came to me and said, you are two completely different people to me. You are so kind and loving here. We were teenagers, so he probably didn't use the word loving, but that was the message. You're so kind here at youth group, but man, you treat me like dirt when we're at school. To which then led to a lie when I said, no, I don't. I did. And he's not the last one I've ever treated that way. I've been manipulative. Man, in the world in which we live, if I look back at my history with my other college girlfriend besides my wife, and while no, we didn't do some of the physical things that people typically think of, man, I was not a good boyfriend. I deserved all of my stuff to be ripped up and sent back to me in the mail. At the time, I thought she was going overboard, and the older I've gotten, and the more I've looked at the way I treated her, the more I'm like, nope, I deserved every last bit of that. I'm a hypocrite. As a kid, I remember I knew what kind of words I was supposed to use and not use, and so I would just whisper them under my breath when I was at recess so that I could be a rebel and cuss just like all my friends were cussing. And tell the jokes that I knew shouldn't be being told, and listen to the music that I knew that I know shouldn't be listened to. That's why I finally stopped taking my earbuds on my runs, because I realized, man, my running playlist is not good. This is your pastor listening to music that he knows he shouldn't be listening to. And I've been judgmental in my history and in my current life. It is still a temptation that sparks up every now and then. And I'll be honest, sometimes it's about you all. Because sometimes I sit there and I go, why aren't they getting what I'm preaching on Sunday morning? I understand it. Why can't they? I'll be honest, as a pastor, it's hard to hear someone say, great message, and then immediately do the exact opposite of what that message was about. Until I stop and look at my own life and go, Justin, how many times have you done the exact opposite of what you just spoke about? I think of John Mark Comer, who wrote a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which is all about taking the Sabbath, and his own admission of, man, sometimes I get so busy that I don't take a Sabbath for like a month or two, and then one of my kids will point out, Dad, you wrote the book on this. And I go, oh, you're right. I literally wrote a best-selling novel about this, and I still struggle with it. Church, I am not worthy of being your pastor. Jesus is the only one who would be worthy of standing up here and sharing with us. And they even rejected him, because our human nature is to reject people based on their history, based on their past, based on what we think about them and what we know about them. But it's not about what we think about them and know about them. It is about what he thinks about them and what he knows about them. He is the only qualifier for taking his message out into the world. And he has said, I want you all to do it. I died for all. We participated, we received the Lord's Supper this morning to remind ourselves that he did that for each and every one of us. And I said that there's some advantages and disadvantages to living in a small town. And one of those advantages is, man, when someone is hurting, there are people everywhere to step in and to help out if they'll let them know. Because it is a community that is tight-knit and is loving, and you know each other. But there are disadvantages to living in a small community, and that is that you know each other. That we know each other. 4 years ago, I was an outsider. You didn't know all of my history. The Kwanzas are coming in right now, and they're from the outside. You don't know all their history. But with Courtney, we had that conversation before she stepped into her role of, hey, they all know you. And there's going to be some unique challenges that you're going to face that I never had to face. My brother is the lead pastor of my church that I grew up in, and there are some unique challenges that he had to face that I haven't had to face, simply because they knew him. The only way that we will ever get past that, and that we will ever be able to look at each other and say, it is not about the things that you've done in your past. It is about where you're walking now, is that we have to daily remind ourselves to walk humbly together with Jesus. It'll be a different word on a different day, and that five-word phrase that you're going to need to focus on. But church, we've got to remind ourselves daily that we have to walk humbly together with Jesus. We've got to be moving, and we've got to be humble when we're doing it. That it can't be that I'm better than you. We can't be, James and John saying, Jesus, I want to sit on your right, and my brother wants to sit on your left. But then we say, no, we are all walking with you, Jesus. We are together in this. We are not going to reject a part of the body because that part of the body hurt us at one point in the past. And we're also going to do it all with him. With him leading it, not us leading it. With him being the redemptive one, not us offering redemption. With him deciding when someone is forgiven, not us deciding when someone is forgiven. Easter was all about that. Easter was all about us being able to come together to him. That's the freedom that he gave. And he invites us every day to walk humbly together with him. So this morning, I'm going to leave you with two questions. I'm going to leave you with these two things to consider. How have you disqualified yourself from serving Christ? instead of accepting his forgiveness. Because the truth is, when we stop and we get honest with ourselves, we realize I am a mess up. That was part of my resume. I could give more. I'm not proud of any of that stuff. But it's still a part of what I've done. And it's still a part of what I can still struggle with. And I can easily sit here, and honestly, there have been times with our BSL, our Board of Servant Leaders, where I've sat there and said, I shouldn't be doing this. And they've said, no, you should. And they've had to encourage me to stick with it. Because, church, I shouldn't be by human standards, if not for him. If not for his forgiveness and redemption. And you may be doing the same thing to yourself, saying, I'm disqualified from serving Christ because of my own past. Church, he is here to forgive each and every one of us sitting in this room. And he doesn't say, hey, ask for forgiveness today and I'll think about it, and then maybe tomorrow or next week I'll give it to you. He says, if you need forgiveness, if you know, if that's there on your heart, then come to me now and I will wipe it clean in this moment. And if you're sitting there and you're like, that's me, I need that, I'd encourage you every time, use the altars for it. Yes, you can do it in your seat, but there is something about actively moving and saying, Christ, you went to a cross for me. I can walk to an altar for you. And it's also a way for the body to be able to pray for you. And I get it. We come to the altar and we immediately think everyone's going to look at us and go, ooh, what did they do wrong? Everybody has done something wrong. If we hadn't already asked for forgiveness before we came in this room since last week, then we should all be at the altar asking for forgiveness this morning. The second question is, who have you disqualified from serving Christ instead of forgiving as Christ forgave? Who are you disqualifying and saying they shouldn't be someone that Christ would use because I know what they've done in their past? Who are you holding back that Christ is saying, no, this is someone I want. This is someone I died for. This is someone I have empowered and I have given a gift and I have called to do this. So stop disqualifying them. How have you disqualified yourself? And who else are you disqualifying?